I'd like to continue our journey through the Gospel of Matthew. We've been looking at chapter 6, the Sermon on the Mount. And I'd like to talk today about the idea of fasting, which we see in verses 16 to 18 of chapter 6. Fast, in terms of our tradition from the Hebrew Scriptures, the only fasting described in the law of Moses was the Day of Atonement. We see this in Leviticus chapter 16, verse 31. So a very important day, a day of fast, a day of forgiveness, a day to really look within ourselves and to look at those things that need to change and to embrace that change in a spirit of self-sacrifice. However, it's very interesting that the practice of fasting was very common in later Judaism. So the Hebrew Scriptures just really speak about the one day, but later Judaism really speaks about it as a very important spiritual practice. So we can see development in this concept of fasting. And we see this in the Didache from around the time of Jesus in 9:1 in the Didache. Fast was abstinence from food for the entire day, so no food. Very much similar to the Islamic practice with regard to Ramadan. Before sunrise, having a meal, and then fasting completely until sunset. Fasting twice a week in New Testament times was regarded as a sign of devotion. So the idea was that we would pick the 2 days, fast on those 2 days, and on those 2 days, it's a reminder to put God first, put our relationship with God and the Lord in as a priority in our life. And so food is secondary, God is primary. Jesus, in speaking about fasting, says, "Do not look gloomy like the hypocrites." So you don't want to give it away that you're fasting. You want to fast in a quiet way. You don't want to draw attention to your fasting. You don't want to advertise, carry a sign saying, "I'm fasting." You want to do it quietly because it's a spiritual practice for yourself. In terms of charitable works, those are done in an exterior way to assist those in the community. And even those, of course, Jesus encourages us to be subtle and quiet about them. But those certainly would be more public, whereas fasting is certainly, we see, a more private, personal activity. The idea of "do not look gloomy," it's interesting, the translation, the more literal translation, means to disfigure or render unrecognizable. So you don't want to disfigure yourself. It's not gloomy in the sense of being sad, but it's some sign that would say that you are different. Kind of similar to what our practice might be on, say, Ash Wednesday, where there is a disfiguration of oneself. One puts ashes on one's forehead to disfigure oneself. And that, of course, marks the beginning of a penitential season. But to do that when you're fasting, Jesus says, not a good idea, because it's then more about drawing attention to yourself and less about the fasting. We see this in the Hebrew Scriptures in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 14, verse 4. They cover their heads. Jeremiah speaks of people who, when they fast, would be covering their heads. No. Jesus is saying, don't cover your heads, because, again, what's that doing? It's saying, well, this guy is fasting, he's got his head covered, not a good thing. 1 Maccabees 3:47 sprinkled ashes on their heads. This was part of the ritual of grief or mourning in the ancient world, where you would put those ashes on your heads. And Jesus doesn't recommend that with regard to fasting. But again, with Ash Wednesday, it's the marking of a beginning, of a penitential season. It's not saying, here I am, I'm fasting. It's saying, let's begin this in a communal way altogether. And again, it's not done as an individual, but it's everyone in the community who is taking on those ashes. Now, sackcloth and ashes, which we talked a lot about in terms of penitential terms, they were really put on to make the person unsightly. This person was doing a public penance. So sackcloth and ashes would be appropriate for a public penance because you're telling people, I committed a public sin, I did something that harmed the community, now I'm going to put on the sackcloth, I'm going to put on the ashes as a sign that I acknowledge that I have harmed the community, I have done something to demean the community in some way or some member of the community. I have been a cause for scandal. I am sorry about that. I'm going to ask forgiveness of God, certainly, but I'm also going to ask forgiveness of the community that I have harmed. So in that case, the sackcloth and ashes would be appropriate, not in the sense of drawing attention to oneself for doing a penitential practice, but saying to the community, I am sorry, I am doing my reparations, I'm giving back to the community, I'm going to try to undo the harm that I have done to the community. When you do fasting in such a way that others know that you are fasting, Jesus says, well, step back, take a look at that. In a way, you've already received your reward. Maybe your reward is the recognition from others in the community that you're fasting. Is that really the reward that you want when you fast? Well, let's think about it. When we fast, what are we trying to do? We're trying to make the Lord the priority. We're saying, it is the Lord who comes first. I love the Lord. I want to increase my devotion to the Lord. This is what I want. And so we put the Lord first. And for us, that is important when we fast. But if we're fasting for ourselves and for self-satisfaction, that I can do it, we're fasting to lose weight, this is not really then a religious practice, is it? It's more of a personal challenge to ourselves. But it's not saying, well, I want to fast because I want to say to my God, whom I love very much, you come first. And the food and the enjoyment of food is a secondary item. Certainly we need food to survive, and we have to be careful when we fast to do it in terms of a health context. Doing it with certainly a doctor or a dietitian, nutritionist would be important. It would also be important to consider any medical conditions that we might have, like diabetes or high blood pressure, or others, and take that into consideration when we fast, certainly. But really, the fasting is to say, God, you're first. You are number one in my life. And so the Lord suggests ways to do that. He says, first of all, anoint your head. Jesus speaks about anointing, make it seem like you're celebrating. Put some oil on you, so you don't give away the fact that you're fasting. Then wash your face. That's great. Make sure your face is clean. And it's interesting that both the washing and the anointing were done to prepare for a banquet. So we have the paradox here. We're fasting, we're giving up food, we're putting God first. But at the same time, we're taking on those actions that would prepare us for a banquet. So what is the banquet we're preparing for when we fast? The banquet is experiencing in a deeper way in our own lives the love of God. And that banquet is the most beautiful banquet we can ever experience. It's a banquet of deeper communion with our God who loves us so much.